So I'm going to get the record button started here.
Don't scare him too soon, Bill.
No, I know. Yeah, we'll bring him in gently. Yeah. So we'll be nice to Mike. So get everybody else a good feeling about oral reviews, right?
If it works out well for me, I'm all for it. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me pray for us and ask the Lord to give us some direction and give Mike peace and just lead us through this time. That's our desire, Father, that Mike can just present what you've given him to him. We just thank you, Lord, for the gifts, the location, all that you've given Mike to accomplish the work you want him to do there, Lord. And we thank you that he's coming to this place in his journey with BGU, ready to graduate. Yeah, I just thank you for him and his life. Just pray, Father, you'd watch over all the technology and all the things that can go wrong during these oral reviews. And we just thank you so much that you're our Father, you're our God, our Savior, Jesus. And we just trust you and love you and want to be all you want us to be wherever you put us. It's in your name, Jesus, we're praying. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, I'm going to just kind of go over the ground rules a little bit so we all are all together. Mike's going to give us a presentation. He's got a PowerPoint up and kind of give us a summary of what he did to the dissertation and kind of will refresh our minds and our memory. Then we'll have a little bit of a time for some discussion and questions and what any of you all want to bring into the mix here. Once we've done that, then three of us, Chuck Barber, Steve Coe, and myself, I guess we're kind of the official of grading committee. We'll meet together for probably 15 minutes, which means I'll break the rest of you out of the session for that time. Once we're done, then I'll bring you back into the session and we will give you the results of what we've done in terms of the oral review. Okay? So with that, Mike, you got your PowerPoint up. Let's go ahead and
Bill, before Mike jumps in, I just want to give him just a little bit of an endorsement just to kind of maybe help break the ice for him.
But, sounds good. Go for it.
I wanted to, first just let you all know how proud of Michael I am. I mean, this was a very good journey for him. This dissertation project gave him an opportunity, to integrate, principles and develop an instrument to assess, organizational effectiveness, climate, employee engagement, and at the same time integrate those transformational leadership perspectives and theological principles, to kind of get that done. And so I think what you will see is Mike has kind of developed an enduring framework, that will help organizations in the future, to kind of ensure not only that joy at work is present in the workplace, but to also give organizations an opportunity to really assess, those transformational leadership perspectives and capabilities that they have, within the organization. So I don't want to steal Mike's thunder, but I just wanted to really, give him a pat on the back and just let him know how proud I am of the work that he did, with putting this project together.
All right. Yeah, well said. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you. So, but before I get started, I want to introduce, I can't see everyone on there with my display the way it is, but explain to you who's in the room with us. First, we have Brent Barrett. Brent was the acting chairman of the elder board when I was the lead pastor at United Evangelical Free Church in Seattle up until the end of 2016, and was just a brother with me as we were trying to navigate cultural transformation at that nonprofit sector. And so we kind of shared the struggles and the joy of that journey together. So it means a lot for me that he's there because a lot of what I'm doing this evening has come from that experience. And then Bruce Martin, I've known Bruce since I went to seminary at Dallas Theological, and he's been like the spiritual father to me. So when I talk about the journey of transformational leadership, it really started when I first encountered him, when he would always just say, you don't impart what you know or what you do, you impart who you are. And that's something that's always just stuck with me, for better or for worse. So I'm honored to have these guys here and to witness where this has come into where it is now. So welcome, guys, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
But yeah, I'm Mike. I'm being a candidate for Doctorate of Transformational Leadership and Cultural Transformation. A quick little intro before we get into it. I wasn't intending on getting a doctorate at Bakke. I originally was going to get a teaching certificate in theology of work and integrate that into ministry. But in Seattle, there were two experiences that kind of led me to this point. And so this is a 3-year journey for me, more than just a project. While I was getting my teaching certificate in theology of work, we were trying to lead some deep organizational transformation at United in the church level. We reached a point organizationally where we all wanted the same thing, and we had what we needed to pull it off. But when we got together to work it out, collectively, we're still producing results nobody wanted, even though we wanted the same thing. And the effects of that was levels of disengagement in a nonprofit world. And so there's just the normal being disengaged, where people are showing up and kind of just punching the time clock, doing the bare minimum. And then there's, in addition to just being disengaged, there's the actively disengaged, where people are expressing their unhappiness in words and actions and in their attitudes. And so I was in a moment, I was like, how can we all want the same thing, yet still produce results that nobody wants? And I was taking my last class at the teaching certificate level, servant leadership. Just kind of stumbled into that class. And I read something by Robert Greenleaf, who reintroduced servant leadership to the US in the 70s. And he said, if I had to do it over again, I'd work in a large business over an extended period of time to affect the most change in culture. He says, because of marketplace sensitivity, business is usually the fastest to adapt and usually the quickest leader to lead change, whereas government and church are usually the last two places to adopt change. And it was those two experiences that made me want to look at how we could still produce results nobody wanted, even if we wanted the same thing, and particularly what that looks like in the private sector and in business, as well as the nonprofit. And so what this is this evening is just the culmination of just those two prodding questions. But the objective for tonight is for me just to share my research findings on how to increase levels of employee engagement in both public and private sectors using source-based development. And let me define what that is for people in the room who aren't familiar with it, as well as those who are probably watching the recording. This is a term adopted from Otto Scharmer. He said the source is that deep place inside of you where you tap into your highest future potential self, or as Christians, we could say your new self in Christ. And that deep work you're called to do in the world, that we were created to do good works, created in advance for us, that we are to discern. And so while he wouldn't put the Christian lingo on it, that's what we think of when we think of source, your highest future self and that deep work you're called to do in the world. And so how do we tap into that? I just found that there's 3 practices present in people who could tap into that source: meaningful connection with those around them, foreseeing or contemplative action or mindful action, and we'll get into that as well as responsible risks. And so I want to explain that. I want to share how I applied those to Work Matters, where I was, and am currently applying it to Work Matters, as well as to the public sector or private sector of Walmart. So the image to kind of help you understand what we're doing here this evening is Bill O'Brien, former CEO of Hanover Insurance. Some of you may be familiar with this quote. He says, "The success of the intervention, the results depend upon the interior condition of the intervener," meaning it's not so much what you do or how you do it that dictates the results, but the inner place from which you operate, that source. And so what I did is I took Otto Scharmer's Theory U, who kind of as a practice of social technology to connect with the source, and I was more interested in the capacities that one needed to possess to be able to travel that journey, to connect with that source and come out on the other side with a sense of responsibility of what's to be done. And so that's the image we're going to tie a lot of our content to this evening. And so what I want to do is first, in an introduction part, I wanted to understand what's currently happening in the area of employee engagement. And Gallup has been tracing this since 2000. And what I found from Gallup is that currently 33% of the employees in the US consider themselves engaged, 13% worldwide, so it drops significantly. 52% would describe themselves as not engaged. These are the people who are just showing up. 18% are actively disengaged, like spreading disengaged. And so those percentages have really not changed since Gallup began its research in 2000. What we find is that the cost of this is great, that disengagement costs businesses $12,000 per year per employee. And what that means collectively in the US economy, it costs $600 billion annually, and globally it costs $7 trillion annually. And so currently they're saying that US companies are maximizing only 5% of their resources. But those companies who are able to increase employee engagement hold a significant competitive edge over their peers, earning 147% more in earnings per share. And so this is a significant issue that, if addressed, yields profitable and purposeful results. And so what I wanted to look at is, seeing this information, I wanted to know why, like what has happened in the past in organizations, what's happened collectively to get us to this point. And through my research, I really found that there was 3 fundamental shifts that occurred when our society went from the Industrial Revolution to the technological revolution. There's 3 shifts in work that we had to deal with. One was a shift in labor, that we shifted from manual labor to knowledge labor. Manual labor, the biggest asset a company owned was its supplies, was its factory. And Henry Ford was famous for saying, "Why, when I hire a set of hands, does a brain attached with it? I just want the hands to do the job. The thinking is outsourced to higher levels. I just need them to do that repetitive task over and over again on the assembly line." With the rise in technology, it shifted from manual labor to knowledge labor, meaning the greatest asset a company had was no longer the computers that they possessed, but what was inside their knowledge worker. And so how do we then re-engage them in the process and tap into that greatest resource over which they had no control? Second shift was the shift in employee expectations and what work was supposed to offer them. The old manual labor narrative is efficiency plus productivity plus quality equals profit. But when you had to tap into the deepest capacities of your knowledge worker, the narrative kind of shifted from that to joy, meaning you need the exteriors of efficiency, productivity, quality, and profit, but you also have to include that interior world of the employee if you're going to maximize and bring out what they're capable of doing. And so these other expectations, psychologically, they use the word PERMA, became important in the workplace, where they needed to experience positive emotion at work, be engaged with what they're doing, have meaningful relationships at work, and find meaning in their job, and having a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day. Simon Sinek said it's not so much what the worker does that brings out their productivity and maximizes their joy, but it's how they feel while they're doing their work. Others like Robert Keegan out of Harvard says that the joy is defined as happiness, that they need to fully realize their potential at work and their purpose through what they're doing. That burnout happens not because someone's working too hard, but they've been working too long and not experiencing any sort of development as they've worked. The last shift is a shift in complexity. The marketplace demands that employees function with a greater mental complexity, tap into deeper psychological resources, and work with a greater sense of urgency than ever before in human history. And so you have this greater need for companies, and you have that coupled with another condition that's happening is the employees are hiding, that they can't match the need for mental complexity right now. They can't match the need for physical resources. And so Robert Keegan says what happens then is we end up paying people to do 2 jobs. The one we hired them to do, and then hiding their weaknesses, their mistakes, their fears, their errors, and their insecurities. And so to help our people tap into our workforce greater than just 5%, we got to help people come out of hiding and be more fully developed. So the objectives of my research, we'll get right here on the right part, is since Gallup has already performed the quantitative aspect of research, I really wanted to address the qualitative aspect to this issue. And so what I did is I combined appreciative inquiry, which focuses on what's working well, the strengths, what's going well, and building on those. So I combined appreciative inquiry along with Otto Scharmer's theory U, which would be kind of what that iceberg represents. And I wanted to discover the gaps that exist between people and their work. I wanted to see the inner quality of those who were able to somehow close that gap, what those qualities were, and then be able to design and develop intervention strategies to help other people close that gap between them and their work so they can work with the complexity that's needed and the psychological resources that's needed. So my research design and methodology, like I said, is I use inductive qualitative research. Specifically what that means is I performed from Otto Scharmer's theory U, their U journaling process that's designed to bring people down through that iceberg image. It's a journaling process that lasts about an hour, and I perform that exercise and debrief that exercise with the executive leadership of ArcBest People and Culture Department. ArcBest is a logistics department on the Fortune 500 list. ArcBest is a logistics company. It's currently ranked at 774. The people in the room were 5 people who were responsible for overseeing 60 members of the People and Culture Department to oversee the development of 13,000 employees. So I was able to apply research methodologies to them, as well as apply the similar U-journaling, interview process from Theory U, and ethnography or job shadowing to 14 young executives in the following industries and companies: banking, marketing, Walmart and Sam's, which you probably have heard of, the vendor company that serves Walmart here locally, Roche Coleman Homes, manufacturing, Dayspring, and the rest. So we've got a pretty wide variety of operations as well as marketing and retail represented. And Dayspring is a subsidiary of Hallmark, and so it gives cards. And so I did that research as well as the theological research that helped me find the buckets that contain these virtues needed to close the gap between people and their work. And Matthew 25 gives these virtues very well. It's the virtues of love, faith, and hope. And so that brings us back to this image here. And what I want to do is break down just my discovery through this process. And I first want to start with the idea of love, or with meaningful connection. The research outcomes is with love. I found that in researching and observing different people, first of all, love, what it looks like in the private sector, is a meaningful connection with those around you. That kind of emerged with me when I was observing the vice president of operations at Roche Coleman Homes with field managers. Field managers oversee the building of 15 to 30 homes at a time. And so they got a lot of pressure on them. They have Tuesday morning meetings. And so I observed him holding the meeting, but before it even started, you should have seen the defensive postures of the field managers in the room. And one quoted and saying, he turned to me and he said, "He came to chew on us." And it was pretty accurate to the point. It was just very closed off from understanding each other's experiences. And so there was nothing productive. People were very shut down, closed-minded, closed-hearted about what was going on. It wasn't very productive. Then I compared that with observing and job shadowing a research and development specialist at Simmons Foods, who does chicken as well as the pet foods and other things. And she would actively go out, she's a research and development specialist, go out into the operations part of the floor to build relationships with the hourly employees there. And she said, they rarely get noticed, they rarely get thank yous. And I find that if you build a connection with them, it just makes the whole process work better. And for me, I've got to have them run tests on the floor. And so the more we're connected we are, the more productive we are together. As I thought about that, I reminded of a quote from the recorded interview from ArcBest when one said, I think over time too, the thing I see a lot of, and what I wrote, and videos are kind of blocking out some of these quotes, not to see this, of what I wrote is this us versus them mentality. And that's the divide of the country, and the divide of any organization is when people don't think they're on the same team. Even if they say that, but their actions don't reflect that, you just get people working in different directions. And I think that's probably the most detrimental thing, is when people can just lay down the differences, look at what's in common, and look at what they're really setting out to do, the same thing. And so I find that the first capacity that people need to possess, and that's absent in a lot of organizations, is a meaningful connection with everyone involved. And so we've moved down. Now let's look at that bottom piece of faith. That what do you do with that connection with people? That the research outcome of faith looks like foreseeing or contemplative action. And what I mean by that is simply this, is the consumer brand specialist at Kraft Heinz, she said, they, being Kraft Heinz, pretend to know consumer behavior. She said they develop items without knowing who they're designing them for. You have to know how to use the data, but the data is good. What she's saying is that what is said well here by the business intelligence manager at Simmons Foods and elsewhere, that we're drowning in data, but we're starving for insight. That there's a qualitative gap between people and their data. We're going to get into this in a moment, but you can't get rid of the human perception. The data doesn't necessarily speak for itself. It tells you what, but it doesn't give you a chain of meaning. It doesn't tell you why. That requires the human capacity. And a lot of people lack that ability to sit with their data and reflect and see what perception is arising. And so we're drowning in data, but starving for insight. And again, a quote that reinforces this from ArcBest is, I think this is probably a societal condition, but right now an underlying theme is change, saturation, and just being overwhelmed with a whirlwind of activity. I mean, nobody disagrees, but in that heightened just sprint, there's a very little time for just the 10 minutes of silence. Actually, Otto, referring to Otto Schermer, would agree. He's like, that's the one practice that would need to be constantly present. This capacity for contemplative or mindful action versus just downloading and reacting. And so from that, we go to this last part, this last bucket of hope, which looks like responsible risk. A product developer at Dayspring with a supervisor, as I've observed her with her boss, he said, Pixar uses this language of current worst version as a proof of concept instead of minimal viable product. So we need to learn how to test and to learn and to iterate. And what he was saying in that was he later clarified that he's talking about this approach brings up acts of bravery because it creates a culture of creativity and innovation. That it creates action confidence for someone as they begin to test perceptions they believe to be true, that they've gathered the data necessary to have a perception by having a meaningful connection with the system they're part of. They set with that data to create a perception, and then they get this idea of an intervention strategy that they test and they see fruit, and all of a sudden they get action confidence to move forward and to persevere with that perception and that intervention. A little quote here that kind of iterates that is from Mark Best. It's, I think the hard time people balance with our values, and this is just their quote, so forgive the stumbling. I think the hard time keeping people balanced with our values and the business results and the numbers. That balance, especially when you're not in the business and you're not going alongside to help them, is so hard because you see the leaders get so focused on the numbers. And they mean well, and they know the other stuff is good stuff, but then the whole balance of doing anything about it. They've got to get the results. They've got to get the numbers. They don't have time to be transformational leaders. They don't have time to care about people and love on people, or only so many at a time. And so, well, he said, be a leader and a manager at the same time is the way I would phrase it. I would word it this way. Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, he says, today's culture of quarterly earnings hysteria is totally contrary to the long-term approach we need. That quarterly profits is preventing us from long-term vision and long-term development. And so what I did in terms of the intervention trainings, I took this data and I put it together in an intervention strategy to help these 14 young executives, and applied it again recently to 17 more young executives. How do we address this gap between people and their work? And so here's what came about. We started with the idea of a mental mode, challenging people to be a reflective practitioner. For the group, we put their work in the larger story of God's work in the world of creation, fall, redemption, and renewal. But the idea is to create, to help people understand the operational narrative, using that iceberg image. What's going on beneath the surface that's really driving my results and driving my behavior? What beliefs are there? We wanted to expose people to systems thinking. So often it's this us versus them mentality when it comes to issues at work. And taking a selfie is turning around and taking a picture and realizing that your output is someone else's input and that you're all part of the same ecosystem. And so you own responsibility for what's happening there. But the good news with that is that you also have authority to do something about it. And the last piece is helping people look at their life view and their work view. Are they in balance? Are they aligned? Is your belief and your behaviors in line? Most people share a common vision for what a good world looks like, where everything works for everyone, no one is left out. There might be some nuance to it, but we have a similar vision. And so why do we have this belief and our behavior so disconnected from that? And so we wanted to address the mental mode that drives people's work. Now we get into the rest of the intervention strategy is looking at love or meaningful connection. We started with the parable of sheep and goats in Matthew 25, where there's a group that had the capacity to feed the poor, to clothe, to care for, and there was a group that did it for the least of these and those who didn't. And Jesus said, when you did for the least of these, you did for me. When you didn't do for the least of these, you didn't do for me. And what he was talking about is what meaningful connection looks like is the authority, the external authority of your position, matched with the internal vulnerability of those people around you, especially the most vulnerable. Who are the people that you rely on to get the job done, and how connected are you to their experience, to their perception, to their thoughts, and to the way they're doing things? And really here, it's the idea of separating when you get to this meaningful connection piece, you start dealing with a fact versus a perception. Right now we get data all the time at Walmart with facts. of what's happened in the past. But the thing about a fact, like, John Wilkes Booth assassinating Abraham Lincoln, that's a fact. But the unfortunate thing, it's usually when you find that fact, it's too late to do anything about it. And so we get these facts that we're reacting to. We're always going from one ditch to the other ditch, one extreme to the other. And we have no perception that we're not really connected to the people who are doing the work. We're just looking at our spreadsheets 2-3 steps removed from the people who are doing the work. Meaningful connection says you have to be intimately connected to the people who are doing the work if you want to get the perception and see what's happening in the moment. That yes, you need big data, but you need deep data too. You need your perception, like what's happening to you as you observe people is just as much data as what you see in a spreadsheet. Next thing is faith, that foreseeing or contemplative action. The parable of the talents comes into play here. You had 3 people, one with 1 talent, one with 2, one with 5. 2 of the servants understood their role as stewards. Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done, I care about the results. Good and faithful, I care about the strategy. Servant, I also care about the inner place from which you operate. And they believe themselves to be stewards or stand-ins for God and the world. And their master could reap where he didn't sow. And they believed that because of their steward, a stand-in role for God, that they could get a sense of what's emerging in the immediate, just like their master could. And so 2 were able to do that, double the talents. 1 acted out of fear and was disconnected from that and kept it the same. But the point of that is it connects action with contemplation, meaning you take data and you sit and you reflect with it to create a sense of perception with it, of what's happening in the moment. And you take that perception and you turn it into an expression or to an outcome. It's the difference between downloading, doing what worked for you 10 years ago, which is unhelpful because usually it's the solutions of yesterday that created the problems of today, to leading from that emerging future where you're sitting with certain options and you use the consolation and desolation of the examine, where you sit with potential outcomes, you sit with the data and you sense what's energizing me, what's bringing out the best creative potential in me, what outcome is connecting me more with my team, with God, or in a different context with the universe, what's happening with the organization as a whole. I'm going to follow that fruit. And then there's something as what's happening in me that leads to frustration, that doesn't tap into the greatest potential of the team, that tends to divide relationships than unite. That doesn't seem to be where God is leading me. So I'm disconnecting from that. And so it's paying attention to what's happening to you as you deal with these with data is just as important as a spreadsheet. So everything that's happening to you is data, and that we tend to feel the future before we can actually actualize it and see it. And so it's validating that approach. The last part is hope or responsible risk. You had parable of the virgins. They all got their oils. Some brought extra oil, some didn't. They all fell asleep. And just from seminary, I was always taught that, it's a risk to fall asleep because you might stand out. You might miss out on something. But some came with extra oil who were prepared for the long-term vision of things, whereas others just took the oil that the lamp gave them, which is usually like 2 hours. And the one that brought the extra oil were the ones that were able to join the bridegroom in the party, and the ones that lacked that long-term vision missed out. And so the takeaway is the idea of responsible risk is connecting short-term plans with long-term vision. I love Robert Keegan's approach to testing this short-term with long-term, which is smart. You've got this perception you have from sitting with the data, and you feel like there's something to this. How do you test its validity? You make a small test that's safe, meaning if it went wrong, you could deal with the outcome. It's modest. It's actionable, meaning it's something that can be done quickly. You take a research stance, so you're just trying to learn from it. You're not trying to fix or adjust, and then you just test it. And then you look at your results, and then you iterate and iterate. Same thing that Gideon did with his fleece test, testing it twice to make sure that what he was sensing from God, what he was feeling was actually true. God didn't condemn him for that. He met him where he was. Or Cisco, when they do their 0.8 version, like just bring me a prototype and let's test with it. Let's see its prototype and let's follow the fruit and iterate from there. So with that, what I discovered with the transformational results is overall, the people that I presented this teaching to, I provided feedback forms as well as other meetings afterwards. The teaching tested consistently as something that they found valuable, relevant, and useful to the workplace, with many applying these principles to their work in the immediate sense. Particularly the reflective piece of it was probably the biggest fruit. Personally, for me, it changed the way I addressed the complexity I faced in two arenas. In Work Matters, which is the role I'm kind of finishing out and transitioning out of, I was asked to lead the team's vision retreat for a 3-year plan, and I applied an adapted version of the U-journaling to time off, and we quickly discovered that we did not have the meaningful connection we needed to make a good plan. We didn't know who our customer was, and we were too far removed. And that completely shifted our approach for the next 3 years, is to regain the right perspective. So we're not leaning on the past, but we're connected to what's happening in the now and the future. More recently, I took a job at Walmart's risk operations to apply these principles to the current situation. And so Walmart's risk operations is called CMI. I came at a time when they were doing a fiscal year 19 needs assessment. And so I applied my methodology, the stakeholder interviews and job shadowing to their issue. And so I was able within a few weeks to get a pretty interview and job shadowing of the adjusters who are handling these claims for associates as well as customers. And the goal was to see, why do we have behavioral gaps on the floor compared to what we're doing in our training and development department, which is where I was working. And I found out very quickly that there was no standard SOP, standard operating procedure, happening on the floor. There was a disconnection to what was happening in the training department and what was happening on the floor. And that disconnection was happening because the team leader that was over the adjusters were disconnected and closed off to the training department. And so we had to address that us versus them relationship. And so what emerged from that time together is that we had to create a different perception match of the SOPs that we needed to involve them earlier on in the process. And so it's kind of changed the way that we're going about training now, is that we have an assessment piece, which should have been there the entire time, but we have an assessment piece before we do the additive analysis, that we involve the people on the floor and team leaders on that assessment piece. And so for me, I can go into that more, but I'm already over. The way this idea has kind of iterated for Walmart is this do, know, be. The do and the know is what's happening above the iceberg image. That's what businesses are usually after. And the be piece is something that I feel like is that deep work I'm called to do and offer to the risk operations team. Because that's what's happening underneath the surface. It's ultimately what's going to be driving the results that we're after. And so how these 3 principles and practices have evolved so far in the risk operations is meaningful connection has turned into seeing on the field. Foreseeing action has turned into seeing in the balcony, and responsible risk has turned into seeing toward the future. Meaning that we can't stand back on our silos and looking at our spreadsheets. We have to be on the field at the front lines where the work is being done so that we can have a meaningful connection with the people. At the same time, we need to be in the balcony and see from a 10,000-foot view, just like Tom Brady can on the field. He sees what's happening in front of him, but he also sees the whole field, and he can see what's about to emerge. We have to have that practice embedded in what we do every day. And then toward the future, meaning we've always got to be risk and innovative driven, but we need to do it responsibly and test it. We tend to kind of huddle together, make a 1.0 version, roll it out and wonder why it fails, instead of creating a 0.8 version that we can test and see if what we're perceiving is in fact actually true. And so what that looks like now for me is just kind of a new image of being able to navigate complexity, is to be able to see on the field from the balcony and toward the future.
Okay. Hey, Mike, thank you. Very good. Appreciate that, bringing that all together.
Thanks.
All right. Let me have to click my video in and out sometimes. My computer's having some memory issues when I'm doing the recording and playing with Zoom and some things. And when I turn the video on, sometimes it just sort of has a brain drain. Anyway, that's where I sort of jump in and out. What we're going to do is spend some time now kind of thinking through what Mike has been telling us, thinking in thoughts that were maybe in the dissertation that you want to bring out here. The three of us on the committee, we've got some specific issues, questions that we have to answer on an oral review form, so we may bring some of those into a discussion. So why don't we just kind of open the floor right now, and if you got some thoughts, questions, discussion starters, let's go ahead and move that direction.
Hey, Mike, I'll kick this off because there was one concept that really jumped out at me. Well, and first of all, good job summarizing a lot of good critical information. But one thing I would say is when you talked about improving employee engagement, the one thing that really jumps out to me is soft skills that the leader has. And when we talk about those soft skills, we talk about conflict management, decision making, being a visionary, and soft skills is a term that's used pretty heavily in the current workspace and business environment. So
Right.
if you look at those soft skills and then you compare those to Bakke's transformational leadership perspectives, as you were going along your journey, do you kind of see some synergy between soft skills and Bakke's transformational leadership perspective?
Absolutely. I think meaningful connection. I mean, that's just the word becomes flesh and dwells among us. Like incarnational approach. Like we're not in. We're disincarnated, if I can use that word. I'm sure it's probably a word. But incarnation, being able to step into the world, empathy, right, emotional intelligence, to step into the world of other people. That foreseeing action is reflective leadership. The difference between reacting and right acting is that space for reflection. And so something I do now, and I've presented at Walmart just recently, is those people, like I have a journal every morning, and I've kind of adapted this from this book called Sacred Listening. But I reflect on the previous day. I kind of do an appreciative inquiry approach of what went well, what's happening that's good, what strengths are happening around me at work that I need to carry in me, what did I learn yesterday that struck me that I need to think about more. So I'm taking an inquiry of that. I'm reflecting on what that means for me today. And as a result, I'm setting an intention of what I'm called to serve that day. So I know that I'm not going to get caught up in triangulation. When you get into meetings, people kind of get closed off very quickly. Being able to be connected to the larger work beneath the work of that day helps me shape my intentionality to be a reflective leader. This idea of shalom leadership, that we need to have a system that works for everybody all the time and no one is left out. I mean, profitability is starting to rely on that. And so, contextualization, similar to incarnation, like there's a lot of carryovers. They're just synonyms for the same thing that we really need desperately in the business world. So a lot of what Bakke brings to the table is everything that happens below that iceberg, right? It's that inner place from which someone is operating. The source is calling. Like, am I really functioning out of the self that God's called me to be and doing the work that He's called me to be doing, or am I operating out of my own ego?
Yeah. So, Bill and Steve, I purposely asked Mike that question because sometimes I think even though Mike's project addressed a real world business need, in my opinion, at the same time, it adequately addressed a ministry and a workplace issue, because the fact that he was able to kind of tie some of those business competencies to Bakke's transformational leadership objectives, not only did I think he did a good job of tying in theology, but I think it kind of addressed a ministry and also a workplace issue. So that's why I wanted to purposely ask that question.
Yeah, that's Chuck. That's a great question. Hey, Mike, let me first say that I read some of your earlier versions of your work, and the one I read for this review is at least one order of magnitude better than anything I've seen in the past. You really come a long way from where you started, and I want to commend you for that, because sometimes we kind of lock in on a mindset of our own, and it's difficult to change our own thinking. I think you've made some good progress in your thinking that was reflected in this version compared to previous version. I want to commend you for that. I also just I had some questions that I'm wondering if you did you compare publicly traded versus privately held corporations? What I'm wondering is how much of an impact having shareholders that you have to satisfy has on the leadership of the organization being able to take the risks that are associated with kind of the servant leadership type of approach and building the people and allowing the profits to come along. Did you make any kind of, was there any comparison that way?
Yeah, so one of the vendors, Rich Foods, out of Buffalo, it's still privately owned, family run business, shaped by Christian values. It's an easier sell. Rosh Coleman Homes, privately held. The CEO is one of the biggest donors of our Faith and Work ministry. Very easy sell. And then you get to the Walmart and Sam's Club, and that's when it got really difficult to sell that, because you had to, it's almost that the
Yeah.
but yeah, now you have to show how it serves the bottom line before you can go for, like, just because it's good in and of itself never works. You have to sort of validate the fact that this will somehow affect the bottom line positively. And that's why the statistics of what a disengaged employee costs per year, 12 grand a year, is a really strong motivation to say, hey, I can see how quantitatively this affects us. And so having to rely more on that, I'm finding myself in Walmart having to show how this approach, which is good in and of itself, is profitable too.
Yeah. I want to just share one other thing that kind of came to my mind as I was reading through this. I worked for Boeing for 33 years, mostly in Seattle. But toward the end of my career, I was involved in things that were there was a joint program between the management and the engineers union and so on. And I was the company co-director of that for a period of time. And we were working on trying to address issues that affected what we referred to as an employee satisfaction index. And so, we were trying to work this same issue within that corporation as what you've been addressing with your dissertation work. And we did a lot of surveys and stuff internally that showed pretty much the same kind of data as you showed. And what came out of the Gallup poll about the degree to which people feel like their skills are being effectively used. And, it was the same. I mean, for engineers and scientists, we had 65,000 or so engineers and scientists in the company at the time out of 150,000 people. And we were finding that on average, the organizations, people were saying that they felt their skills were being utilized %. They felt like they had so much more potential to do more, and be more, to have a different kind of work experience, that they wanted to contribute. They really wanted to make a difference, and yet they felt constrained. Part of it, most of it does come down to management processes, like you said.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily that management people are bad. It's processes sometimes that have taken the company to the position it's in, and it's frustrating for managers as well as the workers, because the workers want to make a difference, and the managers want them to be able to make a difference, but they also have a schedule and a budget and all that kind of stuff they got to work to.
Right.
So this whole issue of how do we then transform organizations so that the people who are the workforce feel like they're really engaged, and that they are doing what they're called and gifted for. There is just a very, very complex equation, really, to try and change that sense of actually making a difference in what you're doing, and feel like you're doing what you're called to do or capable of doing. If you want to take it outside of the biblical world, is I've got this potential to do so much more than I'm getting the opportunity to actually do. That really causes people to be very frustrated. So I'm kind of wondering if you found any difference also based on the size of corporations or businesses.
I don't want to give just a downloaded answer. I want to think about that for a moment.
And that's fine. You may not actually have considered that, and I can understand that. And Gallup, the Gallup data doesn't seem to differentiate between
Right.
different different kinds of companies, sizes of companies, public held versus privately held, that kind of thing. It's a very high level kind of assessment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bottom line
Yes.
is that what you've described has a tremendous economic impact, but the human impact is where the real sadness happens.
Hey,
Yeah.
Steve, that's a good point you just made because that FABS data, that survey that's developed by Gallup, that's actually been it's actually been a barrier that we've kind of identified with the Department of Defense. That survey framework is very generic.
Right.
It does not. It is not a proper instrument to really help an organization assess cultural gaps and develop action plans to kind of address those gaps. And I think as Mike was kind of going along with his journey, he kind of saw that, and so that's why his dissertation project is actually at a point where it actually complements that FAS framework, that established framework that the government uses, and actually enhances it some. So this is pretty good intellectual capital and new intellectual capital that could potentially help some large federal agencies improve employee engagement.
Yeah. And I would say, and it's not I would say, but if I remember a chapter when I was giving the background of this issue, I was using Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. I think it's Frederick, I forget, but Laloux. I think he used spiral dynamics to apply that dynamic to like the evolutionary growth of an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's really about their level of maturity more than the level of their size that comes into play. Like small companies usually are what they would call red, very kind of nepotism driven. And so he would say, and I would agree, that it's really looking at not the size, the maturity, because I've worked I'm in my office right now, but work matters. I feel like I could only offer 30% of what I was capable of here at a Christian nonprofit of 6 people, because more so it was the president was also the founder, and it was hard to let go of the past, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd say it's more about the maturation of the organization than the size. But I think size obviously should make you more adaptive if you're smaller, but not necessarily. It depends on.
Yeah, if you can characterize the problem well enough and try and then discern a good solution for it. It's really interesting to me that at one point in my career, I was involved in trying to make sure we had enough test equipment to be able to complete the tasks that we needed to do within the schedule that was required by our government customer. Okay, it was an equipment utilization thing. So had to run several studies on, how much time does it take to test a particular article? How many pieces of test equipment do you need to do enough of those articles to maintain your production schedule so you don't get hit with penalties and that kind of stuff, right? So, we understand how to analyze the utilization of physical equipment. How large of a factory, how many pieces of equipment do you need to have the throughput that's required to meet the demand for your market or for your customer? We understand how to do that with equipment. We don't understand how to do that with people,
Right.
And unfortunately, when you come to utilization of capital items and goods like that you've invested a lot of money in, we want to get about 95+% utilization. We'll allow about 5% downtime for maintenance and that kind of stuff, but we want to be cranking stuff through that process as fast as we can. And using that equipment. If we're not using as much as we have, then we figure out how to get rid of some, or whatever, or increase our market or something.
This is Bill. Let me just ask a question. As you're thinking about what happened at ArcBest, what would you say are some of the most important specific outcomes that you saw happening there as a result of your
results from you is kind of having your neck on the chopping block? And so it's driven by fear, and carrot and sticks just don't work, and fear doesn't work. But that's the most like you talk about we have a reptile brain wrapped, a human brain wrapped around a monkey brain wrapped around a reptile brain. Like fight or flight is the worst way to motivate people. And then you get the emotional part. So you're triggering that fight or flight that's actually preventing them from getting into that deeper neocortex that they need for their work, because they're doing fight or flight. And so we're just not there. We haven't really talked about like sports psychology. They pay attention to the inner place from which an athlete operates. So they have the competitive edge on the field.
Yeah.
You don't hear a lot of that yet on the business.
And you know that from a biblical perspective, that diminishes the creation that God has made us as. And that's, to me, that's the saddest outcome of that condition. It really is. I mean, it's unfortunate that we lose a lot of productive capacity, but the damage it does to people, the diminished value and dignity that results in the people who want to be making a greater contribution, have the potential to make a greater contribution, but within the mechanism of the system that within which the business operates, they don't have the opportunity to really use that potential. So and that's a function, I think, of the way business has evolved in general. But there's the term, the gig economy? It's kind of a new term. You might want to don't change your decision. I'm not suggesting that, but this was a term that I just heard recently from a friend of mine who's a banker in Singapore, and he said, the workplace is changing, and we all can anticipate it, and they characterize it as like a gig. People have a gig to do. And so it's like musicians who get a gig to play at a club for a period. Right? And that's really the direction that a lot of the knowledge work opportunities are migrating. So, there's good and bad about that, right? The bad is that means that job security within long-term job security with a single employer is probably, on its way out for many, many people. But on the other hand, if people get known for being able to do certain tasks and the demand for that task is unknown, so you can match up a person with a need for a period of time, then people can flourish by doing what they're really good at for a period of time for a company that really needs them, so they can make an impact. And if they really have a developed reputation, and there's a mechanism for connecting their skills and abilities with the needs of some employer, then people can, do gigs in their employment. And which, when you think about it, then that has the potential to really help people to flourish. But in another respect, it's destabilizing compared to the model that we've had in the past of what, when I started in the workforce, long-term employment with a single company that had nice benefits was really the dream, right?
Right. Well, and I think
Still is.
In my dissertation, I borrow the language of a no-collar worker, the blue collar, white collar, no collar. That's the person who is the gig. And so, frankly, that's I'm wrestling with that myself internally, that I took a job at Work Matters. I felt like I did the project I could do, and then I was going to reach maintenance mode afterwards. I'm like, no, I need to take what I can do and apply it to different contexts. Mm-hmm. So I get it from the worker's perspective, but also from the corporation perspective, that the stories I get out of Walmart is it's mutual. Like, if they'll use you until they don't need you anymore. And so it's kind of this mutual reality of that, you got to relate that together. And it's very unstable. I mean, I think it was Robert Keegan. He said VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's the world we navigate now. I was like, yeah, it's pretty good. Depressing, but pretty true.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what happened to Bill. Is Bill back on?
I am back on. Yeah, my connection dropped out for a bit, so I didn't get to hear the full answer to my question, but that's okay.
Well, we didn't get to hear it, so we're okay. What question was that?
I was just asking, in terms of your work at ArcBest, what would you say were the major specific outcomes of that interaction, that training for that particular company?
the frustration with with the lack of meaningful connection between the board, who was stuck in an old way of operating before they turned public and have expanded the way they have, to how the business needs to adapt to that new transition. So the people who are actually doing the work felt like the board didn't understand it that way. They were just going off of what they knew to be true and were very closed off to new perspectives. The reflective journaling practice in and of itself, they just found simply refreshing, because they find themselves just reacting to the sense of urgency, whether it be true or false urgency. No one feels like they can afford to reflect anymore, to connect external power with internal power of reflection. And then, so that would be the two biggest takeaways. That I was surprised at how refreshing they found that experience, and how quickly they were won over, I guess, by the model. But I will say that the background of ArcBest is a bit unique, that while they are publicly traded, they still come from a Christian past, and their top leadership are big proponents of servant leadership. So I did have a leg up on that one.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they felt the frustrations and the pain points just because of their growth as an organization to being a publicly traded company. The VP of talent and growth, where's my phone? He pulled out his phone in the middle of my debrief interview with him, and he pulled up the stocks on there, and he says, "This rules everything right now."
You're right.
And he came to get on the same page with his VP of sales, because even they have competitive approaches, values versus outcomes. It's one thing, like if you're running by short term, you're like, yeah, these are nice to have on the wall, but keep them there, because we've got quarterly outcomes we got to hit, because this is everything. And so I just kind of connecting with that pain point quite a bit on those two sides.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would think the challenge is motivating the key leadership, that tapping into some of these internal issues actually will somehow affect the bottom line. When you've got employees that are actually, their productivity is higher, their creativity is higher, there's innovative, activities, thoughts, ideas coming forth. But, that doesn't always happen tomorrow. And so to be able to look at the long haul, the long term of a company, motivating the top leadership at that level, I would imagine is the challenge.
It is. I hold a unique advantage, I think, with what I'm doing with risk operations. So these are people handling claims, right?
Right.
And so you can't outsource perception, like investigations. There's a lot of human bias that has to be involved in that process. And so as we're finding that we're creating a streamlined process with fewer human touches with the claimant, and that makes soft skills all the more necessary to establish that relationship of trust, because they found in work comp claims, especially, words like fear, anxious, worry that come up in recorded interviews, those claims cost 3.5 times more than those that don't. And so I think that the idea of soft skills is going to be an easier sell in this department, because we're realizing that there's an explicit cost tied to one's lack of empathy, of deep active listening, being a claims advocate or a customer advocate. And so I'm curious in this season, as we get more and more efficient and less human contact, that this will be a growing sense of urgency. At least that's the case I'm making tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
All right. Yeah. There has been some kind of a shift in Walmart, at least over the last year or two, than when we've been visiting Walmarts. I'm sure they're pushing some kind of employee engagement with customers a little more. They're working on that. Of course, I know that's for their bottom line, but I'm observing that, at least in Walmart stores I've visited.
Yeah.
Mike, one of the things that I've kind of grown to appreciate with both Bill and Steve as I went through my dissertation process and watched others at Bakke go through it, is how we do a good job of blending practicality with academics. And so with that being said, do you feel like some of the things that you learned, or as you were going through this journey, because you just recently took that job at Walmart, but do you feel like some of the things that you learned during this journey helped you prepare for the job that you have now?
Yes, I think let me get right here. What I did here with this needs assessment was applying my research methodology straight to their pain points they received from senior directors. And so I immediately applied it to there, and what we really observed, I didn't get to show this, is I drew this form at the end that here we are, the training and development team. We're trying to find a way to get standard operating procedures to all the claims adjusters on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter what, eventually the funnel is, no matter what we do, it funnels down to the team leader onto the adjuster. And so what needs to happen more than getting the content around them is we need to have a perception match for SOPs to the team leader from training department, that we need to work together to do this. And that that really is the issue that needs to be addressed, not the standard operating procedures initially, but that came directly out of doing ethnography and doing research with them. And so we really started to change how we do, and we have different phases of training. It changed how we do our training that happens in our controlled environment. And I'm presenting tomorrow the idea that we need to spend an afternoon with all the team leaders to let them establish the standard operating procedures that work for them, not that work for us, but works for them to build on.
Mm-hmm.
Because we want to keep people in a sterile environment and say, this is the way it's done. And they get on the floor, they say, well, here's how it's done in the real world. And so obviously there's a perception disconnection there. And so through establishing connection here, we're kind of rebuilding what we need to do in our first 6 weeks of training, and then what phase 2 looks like for them on the same page. And that just came about the assumption that the answer to our issues doesn't rely on any sort of subject matter expert, on me or anyone else, but it relies on the people who are doing the work on the floor. And if we're meaningfully connected to them, and we're getting a perception of what it's like to be them in their shoes, and that we're actually reflecting on the data together as a team with open minds, not getting mad because it's us versus them mentality, that we're really hearing what they're saying, and we're creating potential intervention strategies. And now it's time to kind of test these with the team leaders and see where the fruit is and go forth from that. And so I get to directly apply what I'm doing, which is good because I don't know much about claims, but I know a lot about this research methodology. And I'm finding out to know anything about claims to unearth the issues, because it's not coming from me. It's coming from, as Dennis Bakke or holacracy would say, it's coming from people who are doing the work, and we've taken that from them for too long, and we've got to give it back to them.
Yeah.
There's a phrase that comes out in my mind. I think it's in Drucker's book on the 5 most important questions to ask of an organization. And one of the concepts I know we talk a lot about in my house is he uses the term constructive dissent, in a group. And to me that it gets back to that whole issue of trying to allay that fear so that we can actually have constructive dissent.
Yeah.
And you're thinking of whether they're team leaders on the floor or whatever it happens to be. I mean, that's an environment, an atmosphere. The leader has to set that atmosphere for that to even happen.
Yeah, and it's really, really hard, especially because this weird thing about this Walmart position is it was created just because I interviewed with them for another role, and they liked what we were doing, and so they created a position to get me on, and they said, just act like a consultant for this next season. And so I did this needs assessment, and my senior director who's there, as soon as I start talking about this perception disconnect and some of the quotes I'm pulling from team leaders, that first reaction is that closed-heartedness and closed-mindedness, like the inner critic, and literally this us versus them mentality, and having to say, hey, if we start doing that, I introduce the idea of systems thinking. It's like, if we don't really realize that we're part of this ecosystem, and that our output is their input, and that we're all connected. I said it a lot better than that, but I was like, we're not going to get anywhere. But it's really hard to get people to really listen deeply. Mm-hmm. And our best tool as a leader is not our knowledge, our SMEness, it's not subject matter expert. It's our capacity to connect with, listen to, and dialogue with those around us. And that's really hard to do.
That's right.
Yeah, good.
Okay, let me ask if Brent or Bruce, you guys are both on the PLC, any comments or thoughts you guys want to throw into the mix here?
There I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
We're hearing you now.
Yeah, I mean, it's good stuff, Mike. I'm not sure that I'd have to think about this as far as the application. He said at the outset that in government and in church kinds of settings, this stuff is really difficult to apply because change happens so slowly.
Yeah.
My experience in the marketplace endeavors that I've been a part of is, there's a strange reality that some of the most effective leaders that are celebrated in our culture today are guys, I think it was Garrison Keillor noted there, are guys who are struggling with such serious insecurities in their lives. They cloak extremely well, but those insecurities provide the jet fuel that propels them to places of a lot of apparent effectiveness. And what you're describing is a kind of shift in not just behavior, but core identity. And at least in the context of the church, I'm just thinking out loud here, in the context of the church, you might encounter an outlier who says, I'm not well and I need to get healed, right? And opens himself or herself up to a man like yourself that says, yeah, you do. You need to take a journey toward self-actualization, toward a more full integration, growth and empathy, all these great things. But in the marketplace, the head scratcher for me is twofold. Number one, leaders of organizations tend to be a certain profile of person who gets it done at the cost of human beings. And like you showed in holding up the phone, and the bottom line is the bottom line, right? And so guys like this or women like this, though they're very effective, just like leaders in churches that I serve, they end up sabotaging the kind of outcomes that you're leaning into because it's just too costly, right? They don't see a way around it. So I love your clarity in terms of what you're developing. But there is this sense, I guess it's not new. Socrates made the observation that most humanity lives in an unexamined life.
Right.
And man alive, you're leaning into a big, big, big mountain. So my word to you is like one at a time, man. One at a time, celebrate that. One at a time, wherever you find yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And as you know, my story better than most everyone in this thing, Britt knows quite a bit, but you can even deceive yourself thinking that since you've got it here, you're essentially practicing it here. And you can kind of fall asleep because you've got the right dialogue and you mistake getting the content right with experiencing it yourself. And that's why I love the word mystic, because no one religion or anyone owns that. It's just moving from groupthink or belonging to this inner experience.
Right.
And I think that's what we need in religion. I think in the church and Christian church, I think it's what we need in business and all around. It's just that capacity to, connect. And so I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm trying to stay there myself. It's hard.
It is. It is.
Any other thoughts or comments anybody would like to throw into the mix? If not, we're going to go ahead and go into an evaluation session for about 15 minutes. So if we're good, I think we'll move that direction.
Okay.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to break different ones out of the session. If you want to come back into the session, you can go and stay online.
You need to help.
Okay, I think everybody is back with us. I see all those smiling faces on the screen. That's good. Dr. Barber is going to announce the results of our evaluation.
All right. So, so Michael, did you tell us that you have a presentation that you have to give tomorrow?
I do.
Yeah. Well, make sure when you do it, introduce yourself as Dr. Reedy.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah. So very good job, and congratulations. You know, we felt like the work in your presentation was actually above average. So, you know, we assigned you a score of high pass. You know, you had a high level of competence and initiative, good implementation skills, much transformational result in the lives of the organization that you interacted with, good writing skills. There are a few minor edits that need to be made, and Steve and I will talk to you. We won't talk to you today. I want you to soak this all in tonight. But
Yeah,
probably what I'll do is I'll give you a call tomorrow, or after I get a chance to kind of talk to Steve offline about just a few minor edits that we want, you know, for your final product. And the reason being, you know, when we put these final products in the BGU library or make them public, you know, we want them to be in pristine condition. And, you know, so that's a document of Dr. Reading, you know, and BGU. So we just want to give you some tips to kind of polish it up a little bit. But
Okay.
great job. Congratulations. And I think your PLC, your wife and your family, they should all be proud of you. I'll give Steve and Dr. Payne, Dr. Cole and Dr. Payne an opportunity. They want to kind of share some feedback as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll just go ahead and chime in, and I'm going to echo really what Chuck had to say. But Dr. Barber, I guess I should. He's going to treat me that way. I'll treat him that way. But I am pleased to be able to refer to you as Dr. Reading. I think that the work that you've done is very good work, and like I told you before, I'm really pleased to see the progression from where you started to where you ended up with this thing. And this is just the beginning for you now, right? Because what you've done with this work has set you up to apply this stuff for the rest of your life. Okay.
Right.
You have, you know, if you're like me, you really won't know where you're going to go with this yet. I mean, God's going to reveal stuff to you, and it's just going to come at you from left field, and all of a sudden you find yourself doing something you didn't expect. But it's going to be because you have put the work into understanding this area and becoming an authority on it. So congratulations. I think you've done very well.
Well, thank you.
Hey, Mike, I just want to echo that. We really appreciate the work you've done. You know, I just kind of appreciate what you're doing too. We had a little conversation before we started this session, and just, you know, taking some of the transformational thoughts, concepts that we kind of talk about as Christians and trying to translate those into a form that is possibly going to make some inroads, you know, into particular areas of business, industry, etc. That's a challenge, but that's kind of, you know, functioning out there in the field where God wants us. And I really appreciate that motivation that you've got to work in that area. I also want to say I appreciate, and I may lose my video here. Let me knock it down a second. So you just have to listen to me. I appreciate the fact that you had a real openness to our input. I know we all, you know, we kind of went back when you started some of this whole document, you know, and I know I threw in some of my feedback. Steve did, Chuck did, and I just really thank you for being open and being willing to just keep working at that process until you created an excellent product. So again, thank you and congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Feels nice.
Well,
and thanks to Brent and Bruce for being here too and being a part of it. And thanks to Dr. Barber for sticking with me for this long.
Congratulations, Mike.
Thanks.
You'll forgive me if it takes me a while to pull that doctor out of my vocabulary.
I'll give you a pass.
I've got a couple of churches out here who are in need of a doctor of transformation.
Yeah, and don't forget, Mike, you cannot write prescriptions.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, well, appreciate everything.
Well, guys, again, I'm gonna let us all go. Again, it's probably getting late in some of your other parts of the world here, but you can maybe go and take a deep breath now, Mike, and enjoy the evening. And we'll be praying and thinking about you as you're doing the work there at Walmart and other places that the Lord, you know, opens up avenues for you, particular giftings and transformational motivations.
Well, thank you guys very much, and I look forward to June.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, guys,
Bye now.
have a great one.
All right.
We'll see y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Bill, for leading.
All right. Bye now.
Bye.